So in this section, you're working on developing ideas and thinking about what work you're going to do for your seminar papers. So this is a little presentation about developing ideas and kind of writing the openings of your papers. I hope it's a helpful way to think about your research as a research problem and a purpose statement. So kind of, yeah, so here we go. So a research problem. Um, the idea behind the research problem as a research tool is to think about research as a response to some kind of problem, right? So there's a reason you're doing research, and that research is to solve or address some problem that you understand. Okay, so or that you don't understand, you want to find out more about, right? So a problem statement serves as a foundational part of your research because it kind of communicates why you're doing the research you're doing. In other words, what your purpose is as a researcher and writer. It's important to, of course, be aware that research problems do not just exist in nature, just waiting for you to like pluck it off a tree. They're artificial entities, right? Something that you come up with through effort. Normally because you've identified some kind of gap of information or understanding within a topic, right? So there you have a problem because nobody else has solved it, nobody else has addressed it sufficiently, and that's the gap that you're trying to at least help close, even if you don't fill it all the way, right? So there's something we don't understand about something that you're interested in your topic, and your purpose then is to help us understand that or help us solve that problem. So in general, the information that forms the problem statement must first be introduced from the literature, right? In other words, from your research, right? Framed around certain theoretical perspectives, whatever viewpoint you value as a researcher, and articulated in a way that clearly represents the interests of the research, right? So, say it in a way that we can get at what you're trying to get us to get, right? Is that good? Get. Okay, here we go. The three major functions of problem statement. So a problem statement represents a relationship between two or more variables that are at odds with each other. A problem statement justifies the usefulness of the information that might be gained by investigating the problem. In other words, you're kind of saying like, so what is the problem? Well, the problem is that there is some kind of incongruity or misunderstanding between two or more elements that you're interested in researching. So problem statements present the purpose of the study to address the troubling or perplexing situation that you're looking at. Okay. So there's three major functions of problem statements. First, they establish the existence of two or more factors that by their interactions produce a perplexing or troublesome state that yields an undesirable consequence. In other words, problem statements represent the relationships between two or more variables at odds with each other. For example, human resource development professionals consistently profess the value of using a systems approach to developing training programs. In actual practice, HRD professionals seldom use all aspects of the systems approach to develop training programs. So if as a field we say something is valuable, but as a field we don't use that thing, it creates a perplexing situation. Either it's not valuable, and we keep saying it is, but it's really not. We need to resolve that problem. Maybe by revising what that system looks like, or it is valuable, but our trainings aren't living up to that, and so we need to reform our training, right? And there are lots of different kind of smaller variables within that we might look at, right? So, in other words, identifying these two things that don't seem to work together helps us understand that there's a problem, right? There's some kind of situation we need to address. It might be Twitter allows us to communicate in this particular way, but in classes we're still teaching people to communicate in this other way. Do we need to change the things we teach in classes to make people better communicators through social media? Or do we need to be critical of social media because it is teaching us bad practices that will affect the way we communicate in academia and other places in our lives, right? And lots of other different complex things we can see in these opposing positions, right? Problem statements also justify the usefulness of the information that might be gained by the investigating the problem. That's so what? Like, why are you investigating this, right? So given that a perplexing or troubling situation exists, we might say, well, many situations exist like this in human affairs, so why does this one matter, right? So the importance of understanding the two statements on the last slide might rest with the need for organizations to make effective use of their resources, right? And the systemic approach is better suited to ensure that occurs. In other words, people in HRD who are spending money on these things would value that if we can say it's going to affect your use of resources in a time of limited resources. The third function of the problem statement is to present the purpose of the study to address the troubling or perplexing situation. That is, what the researcher has planned in response to the opposing factor. There is, of course, an element of subjectivity in the context of literature and what factors precisely are used to frame the problem and what goals are set for the study, right? That's why we have researchers who can research the same problem with different perspectives and different results. Because there's always a human element in your study, right? Why did you choose to focus on those particular things? You have to articulate your choices, and that's part of your problem statement, part of your purpose, right? So the purpose of this study is to investigate what aspects of a systems approach to training and development HRD professionals tend to ignore most often, and why do they do so? That's one way of looking at that problem. There's lots of other ways to look at that problem, right? That's why we can have lots of research still about Shakespeare, right? Somebody's work who has been written about for hundreds of years in books and articles, been the subject of documentaries and movies, etc., and there's still new perspectives that people can bring in their research, right? So in an area like computers and composition, where there seems to be new technologies all the time that might interact with the classroom, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that kind of research, because if you look at the histories that we've been reading, just because something's been examined or researched doesn't mean that it doesn't allow for or make space for, there's not a gap in our understanding about it and the need for more research about it, right? So how do we kind of think about problem statements? Right, this is kind of a typical way to come up with one. It's not meant to say like this is the only way to come up with a topic, right? But this can help you if you're having trouble. So identify a topic of interest. Say like I'm really into students working with pictures in the classroom because they seem to be good at talking about visuals, right? Give them something to write about. Develop expertise in the topic and its supporting bodies of knowledge through literature and or personal experience, right? So in my free time, I like to take pictures, so I know quite a bit about photography, but I don't really know about like using images in writing classrooms, so I should probably research about that. I could do a literature review on that. I could also maybe look at other kind of forms of non-verbal communication as it's used in composition classrooms or in other classrooms. And I might look at, well, what does writing about photography look like in art classes, and does any of that kind of can I pull any of that into composition classrooms, right? Induce potential research problems through a process of continuously analyzing and synthesizing information. So once I kind of find out like what other people are talking about, I might be able to see, right, what things are missing or what gaps in the knowledge exist. What additional perspectives I can bring, right? Confirm the relevance of a research problem through the literature discussion and peer review, right? So once you have your ideas of what you might want to research, you got to make sure you can kind of draw those connections and clearly show how they. I mean, the gap can't be so big that there's no connection between anything that's been written about, right? Your gap should be small enough you can say, like, this is kind of what people are doing over here and people are doing it here, which leaves us this gap here to be better understood or addressed. And then you can finally construct a formal problem statement to help you kind of navigate, like, am I clearly articulating what the problem is, why it matters, and how I plan to address it? Because by thinking about those things, you can better understand whether this problem is something you can actually tackle in your seminar paper, right? Sometimes you get a problem that's like so big that's way too big for the project and the time you had to work on it for a class, right? Sometimes it's really small and you're not going to be able to develop it into something that's enough for your assignment. So going through this kind of process can help you understand whether it's a worthwhile and appropriate research problem to deal with in your particular situation. So how do we learn more about a topic? Well, obviously literature reviews. And I'm not saying you have to go out and write a formal literature review right now with all the relevant information, but the most common process we're finding in developing research problems and writing problem statements is by reading what scholarly literature exists on the topic, right? So once you kind of have identified a general topic, you dive into that literature, and then you can kind of find, well, where's the space for me that I'm interested in writing about this topic, and that also remains to be thoroughly discussed and understood, right? Of course, personal experience is part of that, right? If you are already a teacher, you have a lot to bring, a lot of knowledge to bring to the conversation, and that's okay. You can also talk with other people who are experts in the field, or other people who just have ideas or engage in this conversation. And in this classroom, you have classmates who can be part of that discussion. Hopefully, in the discussion board, we'll see that. As you become more established, you might have your own research agenda that says, like, I do research on disability in assistive technology in composition. And so as you do more and more of that research, of course, you develop a depth of the understanding of the field that you won't get the first time through, which saves you a lot of work moving forward, because you kind of know like what's been done and what needs to be done. And a lot of times, one research project naturally leads to another, because in dealing with a research problem, you might be exposing many more problems around that. 6 interrelated forms of inter-informational relationships. In other words, finding a gap, right? So what does a gap in literature look like? Well, it could look like a provocative exception. So when a consistent accepted conclusion is contradicted by the appearance of a new finding. In other words, historically, academic writing looked like this, but all of a sudden we have these online journals that allow for multimodal writing that can be even more dynamic and interesting, because you can include different kinds of examples than just text, right? And so that kind of provocative exception allows you to say, well, what makes for good academic writing then? Is good academic writing still this traditional peer-reviewed print-based paper journal? Or is academic writing something more? Can we open up that definition of academic writing, right? Contradictory evidence. When contradicting evidence can be shown across findings at the same time. So sometimes people say good writing is the result of this, and other people say good writing is the result of this. And so we can either kind of draw connections between those two things because they seem to contradict, or we can run a study that seeks to find out which one is more accurate than the other, or maybe another option is more accurate than both. Because of being contradictory, they're kind of disproving one another. Obviously, there is the case in the knowledge void, where there is no limited or no research on any topic in the field. Maybe in other fields, or maybe with a new connection or a new question to ask about something, right? So it may be that a topic has been addressed in philosophy, or in literary studies, or in social work, that you want to bring in to English studies, to composition specifically, to computers and composition even more specifically. So there's actually a void, but it doesn't mean there's nothing ever been done about it, right? It just means it hasn't been worked on in our field. Action-knowledge conflict, when individuals' professional behavior differs from their espoused behaviors. That's kind of like that example where it says, the literature says we should do this, but we're actually doing this. So what gives, right? Methodological conflict, when the use of one or another research methodology may provide a source for a research problem. So this is the perfect example for Shakespeare nowadays. You might have papers that look specifically at women characters, or non-white characters, or looks at archival features of different versions of Shakespeare's plays over time based on the different eras in which they were produced. Those are all different kind of methodologies for approaching the same text, as in group of texts, right? And they can each lead to a different way of looking at the problem. Similarly, a theoretical conflict, right? So if you're interested in productive feminist reading versus a critical feminist or a cultural feminist reading. But even bigger than that, theoretical conflicts in saying, that you want to take a deconstructive look at this, right? Employing Derrida and kind of break down the binaries, looking at postmodernism in different works or in different things, right? So you're applying different theoretical filters or lenses to your work can lead to different gaps that we can address, okay? So let's think about the 4 components of a problem statement. You don't necessarily have to write this all out, but I think it's helpful for thinking about it. So a principal proposition, discussion that establishes for the reader what information is generally considered as being beyond question. So what is it that we know? Interacting proposition, discussion that serves to contradict, show exceptions to, or cast some degree of doubt on the principal proposition. So this is everything we think we know about this. This seems to problematize that first proposition. A speculative proposition, a discussion that juxtaposes the previous 2 sets of information and suggests why it might be important to resolve that contradiction that they seemingly have caused. An explicative statement, a culminating statement of how the gap will be resolved in the form of actions that the research intends to undertake, right? The purpose of the research study, what you're trying to do. So here's kind of the standard. This is what people think or what we know. This is the thing that problematizes that. This is why that problem matters, and this is what I plan to do about it. So here's some sample, right? Historical records suggest that Central Ohio typically has a relatively mild winter weather pattern. As a result, local newspapers have reported fewer disruptions of daily life caused by weather. However, the past 5 winters in Central Ohio have been especially harsh, with temperatures ranging well below the daily averages. As a result, most schools have been closed more days than their allotted number. Speculative proposition. If Central Ohio has had relatively mild winters in the past, based on historical information, and if recent winter weather pattern suggests a new weather pattern, which may have detrimental effects on daily life, then more must be known about the current weather patterns of Central Ohio. The purpose of the study is to investigate the recent winter weather patterns and its effects on Central Ohio, right? So this is what we knew. This is what's changed. This is why it matters. And this is what the study plans to do about it. So it's good practice to develop your ideas through a syllogistic process of building from statements to conclusions. But of course, when it comes time to revise your work, you should follow publication guidelines and rhetorical expectations in your organization. So the perfect example of this is the idea of the thesis, right? We tend to front load our thesis, put in that introduction section, even though when we're working through the problem itself, it's the last thing we come up with, right? So just because your process leads you to go from problem to solution, when you actually write that out, right, that solution is going to be front loaded as a thesis, right? That argument you're making. And it's because of the genre expectations in our field, okay? Research questions are optional in English studies. It depends on your specific subfield and where you're being published. But research questions are a fairly standard practice in a number of fields. And in any case, they're a great way to think about your problem as a question that needs to be answered, right? So you come up with this question, and your seminar paper then is an answer to that question, and perhaps several sub-questions. So think about the central question mirrors the purpose statement in a question format. So how do middle-aged white males who perceive themselves as having a stalled career experience this work transition? And from that, you can have several sub-questions, right? So what is the influence of perception of a stalled career on productivity? What is the influence of the perception of a stalled career on organizational commitment? What is the impact of these workers on the workplace power dynamic, right? All these are related questions having to do with this group that you might be studying. So think about your introduction section as setting the stage for your study. It basically has 2 parts. You have a research problem, which is your background, your problem statement and purpose, and your research questions. In other words, what's the thing you're addressing, and why does it matter, and how are you going to address it, right? And then it might lead into your review or your literature review or your framework, where you kind of set up your the concept and how you're going to look at this problem. So the research problem opens with a background to a problem written in 1 to 3 paragraphs. It's a good number, right? That situates the study in a broader context, for example, historical, national, or international, right? Why is this a problem right now? It should hook the reader, provoking interest and making the study relevant or important to the reader. It often starts with a researcher's narrative or experiences of a story, right? A lot of times when you're writing pedagogical papers, you might say, I've noticed in my classrooms, this is what happens, right? And that's different from what we expect to happen, perhaps. That leads then in an interesting way to what you're going to write about. The background then is followed by 1 to 3 paragraphs that kind of formulate the actual problem statement, which illuminates the phenomenon, concept, issue, or dilemma that needs to be investigated. The problem statement identifies a gap in the knowledge about an issue or phenomenon. The purpose statement points to what needs to be done to address the gap, and the research problem determines research design, analysis, and presentation results, because the elements of the study and language used to describe the problem and purpose identify theoretical and methodological information. In other words, you give us a feeling about not only what you're going to talk about, but how you're going to talk about it, right? Makes sense. Right? As you think about research questions, they may be provided in a paragraph form or in a list. And the central question turns the purpose into a question that the study will answer. Sub-questions will ask about considerations related to the central question that you'll address in your paper. Not all authors place research questions after the purpose. Sometimes they appear just before the method or early in the method section as well. Or in English studies, you might leave them out altogether because they can be assumed from your thesis. The review or framework section presents a review of relevant empirical, theoretical, or conceptual works in the form of a literature review, a conceptual framework, or a theoretical framework. This subsection fulfills 5 functions: to build a foundation from the study. In other words, what do we already know that we're building on? To demonstrate how the study advances knowledge, right? So where does it move from what we know into something else? To conceptualize the study. How are we going to talk about this problem? To assess research, design, and instrumentation, right? Why do I make the choices I make about the things I do in my study? Whether that study is archival or whether that study is something I actually do in my classroom, it's still a study. And I still have to justify the choices I make, right? So why am I looking at the literature I'm looking at? Why am I doing the things I'm doing? And to provide a reference point for the interpretation of the findings, right? So if we see that other people have researched this topic and they've suggested that these are the things that are true, when we have our own findings or our own thoughts, our own results of our work, we can say how our own ideas line up with those ideas that are already published in the field. Once again, if you have any questions, and I hope you will as you come up with topics, please let me know. I mean, I'm always checking in on the discussion board to see what's going on there. But if I can be helpful before and kind of in the process of developing topics, I'm certainly happy to do so. I'm here. All right, bye.